So first of all, it's a real pleasure to welcome a speaker who's given so much of his time, expertise, and his voice to Human Animal Trust. Dr. Matt Morgan is a consultant in intensive care medicine and an honorary professor of the public understanding of medicine. Many of you will know him from his regular column in the BMJ, where he brings clarity and humanity to some of the most complex issues in healthcare. Alongside his clinical work, Matt serves as the medical advisor to National Theatre London's production of Nigh and to BBC Radio 4's panel, Best Medicine. He is a prize-nominated communicator who delivered both the Woodridge Lecture in 2023 and the James Reason Lecture in 2025. In 2024, he was named one of the top 50 most influential people in health tech. He also plays a key role in shaping future healthcare thinking as part of the BMJ Commission on the Future of the NHS. Matt is the author of 3 acclaimed books exploring survival, mortality, and what it really means to live. His writing, Critical, One Medicine, and Life 2.0 has inspired readers around the world to think differently about science and the shared experiences shape us all. Through his research, his storytelling, and his global platforms, Matt consistently highlights the real practical connections between human and animal health. As a patron of the Human Animal Trust, he champions collaboration between human and veterinary medicine and uses every opportunity, excuse me, to bring one medicine to wider audiences. We are incredibly grateful for everything he contributes to our work, and we're delighted to have him with us today. Excuse me. Also joining us today, I'm delighted to introduce Julie Askew, the Human Animal Trust Professional Creative Awards 2025 winner, with her fascinating photomicrograph displayed here of cocoa saliva. Julie is a final year PhD candidate at Bath Spa University, working in collaboration with the British Antarctic Survey on her groundbreaking project, Water Universe. Her research explores water drop residues from ice cores and glacial melt, offering a completely new visual approach to understanding water quality, glaciology, and polar science. The first study of its kind. Beyond her research, Julie is the founder and CEO of the Lifeline Project, recipient of the Explorers Club Award coin, founder of the Ilman Wild Art International Juried Exhibition, and a founding member of Artist Ambassadors Against Poaching. She also serves on the Advisory Council of Science, Art, Nature at Stanford in the US, and is the UK International Chair of the Society of Animal Artists. Her work sits at the intersection of science, art, conservation, and public engagement, and we're delighted to have her with us today. Please join me in welcoming both Dr. Matt Morgan and Julie Askew for their webinar, The Art of Evidence. And I will have a drink of water.
Perfect. Wonderful. Well, thank you for that amazing introduction. And I hope you guys can all see my slides. It's a pretty simple slide to start with, but probably the most important, actually. And this is probably my favorite image of all time. If you look carefully, yes, it's a solid brick wall. It's made by a Mexican artist called George Mendez Blake. But rather than just being a solid brick wall, there's something very small, very light at the base of it. And that is what we're going to talk about today, or at least what I'm going to talk about today, which is the power of words. And this small book at the base of this brick wall is important because it's a book written by somebody who was very shy, somebody who didn't publish hardly anything in their lifetime. The book is The Castle by Kafka. And, you know, he never had the confidence really to say his words during his life. And it was only subsequently during his death that his words have had the power to physically change the structure of the wall, society, and the world. And I show that because this is really the message of this talk, that your words, as well as the science, have power. And your words really can change the world. And I'm going to talk you through a little bit about my journey in terms of how I came to realize this, maybe slightly late in life, because for most of my life, I was obsessed with science and data. In fact, I couldn't even spell my own name in school, and that's genuinely the truth. Mrs. Jenkins, my primary school teacher, shouted at me for spelling my middle name incorrectly. Not my first name, Matt, I can spell, but I've got a weird French middle name. But science was always the thing. This is me and my dad using a chemistry set when I was probably about 10 years old. And that's really why I chose the career path I did in terms of going through into medicine and then into intensive care, where we use science and data and fancy machines to try to help save human life. So this is now where I kind of feel the most comfortable. This is my normal day at the office, caring for critically ill people like this person. This is where I don't feel nervous. I feel relaxed and comfortable. Talking to you guys, I'm super nervous, but in this environment, I'm chilled and I'm very calm. But that all changed, and that all changed, like most good stories, over a pint of Guinness, actually. I was speaking at a science conference in Dublin. I was speaking about my PhD, which was based on artificial intelligence and immunology. I thought I spoke quite well, and people came up to me and tapped me on the back afterwards. I showed some new fancy data, and I was feeling quite smug. But then that night, I went out to Dublin. I had a drink of Guinness. I met some local people who lived in Dublin, and they said, "Why are you here?" I said, I'm at a conference. What kind of conference? A medical conference. I'm a doctor. What kind of doctor are you? And this was back in 2018. I said, I'm an intensive care doctor. And they said, what's that? And it kind of made me realize that I've spent decades of my life researching strange niche topics and forgotten about the most important thing, which is the patient, the family, the people we're caring for. They don't even know what my own specialty of intensive care medicine is. And this was before COVID, of course. So yet alone knowing what ventilators are, what high flow oxygen is, how important it is to think about what you want before you're critically ill. And so that really changed my trajectory. I turned from being purely about science and data and turned more into, I think, probably trying to answer this question actually. And this is a question that somebody in medical school asked my group in medical school on the first day. It was a very simple question. What does every patient and family that you'll ever meet over the next 30, 40 years of your career, what do they all want? And lots of people put up their hands. Some people said they want a cure, and that's true. Although 1 in 5 people I care for in the intensive care unit will sadly die. There isn't a cure for them, so surely that can't be the answer. Maybe they want a diagnosis. Yeah, I think that's true, but again, we don't always get there. Maybe they want pain relief. But I think the position that we're at now, and after going through that awakening, I suppose, where I was all focused on the science, I now realize is what people want is somebody to make sense of their story. And yes, that may be a cure or a diagnosis, but sometimes it may not be. Sometimes it might just be somebody sitting in the rubble with them, knowing that they're going to die, for example. Sometimes it might be meeting them, as I did this week, months after critical illness and seeing how life has returned to their life once they are better. But you can't really tell a story without thinking about art, the art of the evidence. And before I was just focused on the evidence. But how else can you tell a story without words, without pictures, without music, without drama, without dance, without theatre, without art? And that's really where my story changed. So it was at the time there were a flurry of medical memoirs being published by Adam Kay and others. And I wanted to tell the story of intensive care, the specialty I did, to answer those people in Dublin that I met that night. And I thought, where better to start the story than at the beginning? And so I traced down the world's first intensive care patient, which was a little 12-year-old girl called Vivi. This is a picture of her on her medical notes, written in beautiful handwritten writing. This is telling a story. This isn't just telling data. And this is her when a doctor made a dramatic decision when Vivi was about to die from polio. They had used the last iron lung machine, the big mechanical machine that could breathe for people, and Vivi was about to die. And so what a brave doctor called Bjorn Ibsen did is he made a hole in Vivi's neck. He placed a small plastic tube there, which we now call a tracheostomy. And then he got teams of medical students, as you can see here, squeeze that bag to keep Vivi alive. And they squeezed it for minutes, and she turned from blue to pink. Then they kept squeezing it for hours, and then days, and then weeks, and then months. And in fact, before the end of the Copenhagen polio epidemic, there were over 300 medical students working in shifts to help keep people just like Vivi and over 100 other children alive just by squeezing this bag. And that was the story of intensive care. That was how the world of intensive care was born, and that was the start of my first venture into storytelling, into words, which was a book called Critical. And I was delighted to give this book to Vivi's surviving family. This is Sven, her cousin, who still lives in Copenhagen, and he shared with me some amazing photos of Vivi, actually, before she was ill, as you can see here, and amazingly, when she survived, because she did live. This is her in her 20s, still attached to a breathing machine, but still doing the things she loves, which was reading. She got married, she fell in love. She had a dog called Bobby, and she used to spend many long, hot summers in Copenhagen with her dog Bobby and her husband at a summer house just in the outskirts of Copenhagen. And so for me, that is the best way to make sense of a story. That is the true art of the evidence. And from there, I was very lucky that Critical, the book, did well, and the publishers wanted a second book. And I have long been obsessed with comparative physiology. In fact, behind me on a shelf is a book, Comparative Physiology by Smith. Here it is. And I was reading this book rather than revise for my own medical exams when I was training to be an intensive care doctor. And I got so obsessed by this that the publishers asked me, well, what's your second book going to be on? And almost out of the blue, I just thought, I must write it about the beauty of comparative physiology and about how animals can teach us how to save a life and why it matters. And if I'm honest, it was the book I loved writing the most, the book I loved talking about the most. And then after that, this year, I've published another book called A Second Act, which takes the story of 10 patients who survived a cardiac arrest when their heart had stopped from all different means, from drowning, from freezing, from being hit by lightning, and what their story can teach us all about really living. And that's a book which is called A Second Act, which was published this year in paperback. And as mentioned, through luck and serendipity and being in the right place at the right time, and through this realization about the importance of story, I've been super lucky to contribute towards lots of different publications, both in the UK and overseas, including in the radio. Best Medicine, which is a great Radio 4 comedy panel show with Kiri Pritchard McLean being the chair and the host, that I'm still involved with today. But the truth is, despite all of those things, the thing which has probably made the biggest impact to people and into my life was something that I wrote just in a couple of minutes on the sofa during the early days of the COVID pandemic. I wrote a message, a WhatsApp message to my mum and my brother-in-law. And I did that because the news kept on saying, don't worry, it's only the frail and the vulnerable who will be affected by COVID. And I thought, well, what if you are the frail and the vulnerable? That's my mum. That's my dad. That's my brother-in-law, who's a wheelchair user. So I wrote them what turned out to be a letter on my phone that night after working in intensive care. And it started saying, to those who are elderly, frail or vulnerable, we are still here. We will still care for you. It was a letter from the intensive care unit. I didn't think much of it, if I'm honest. I sent it to them. They sent it to their friends who sent it to their friends. It then went online. And before I know it, it was being read by around 4 million people all over the world. And there were TV crews turning up at my house. And I tell you that not because it was anything special. Doesn't say anything you don't already know. I say it because that's the power of words. It can really change people and it can really change their story. But it's not just words that can do that. And I'm delighted Julie's with us today. And we're going to talk about the power of images as well as the power of words. I realized the power of images and story through film when I met Stephen and his partner Vicky. Stephen was a chap in his 40s, recently a new dad, and then he suddenly collapsed, became unconscious, and developed what is known as death by brainstem death. He had a massive bleed in his brain caused by a subarachnoid hemorrhage, and Stephen went on to be the first person in the world where the tests we do for brainstem death were actually filmed in real time, and they were shown on a BBC documentary called The Greatest Gift, which talks about the importance of organ donation. And I was one of the doctors involved, along with my colleague, Dr. Chris Hingston, in doing that. And it went on, that series, The Greatest Gift, to win a Welsh BAFTA award because of the impact it had on promoting the ethical use of organ donation. And there are today, 6 people walking around alive back in the world thanks to Stephen's gift of life to them, and many more thousands all around the world thanks to the public health that programs like this have had an impact on. And it's not just that kind of film-based thing that can have an impact. This is a project I did with a Welsh artist called Nathan Weiberg, which takes the words of abuse that were sent to healthcare workers during the COVID pandemic and turns them into this image that you can see in front of us to kind of illustrate the impact that violence and verbal aggression on healthcare workers can have in a real tangible sense. And that was a pretty amazing project to be involved with. And you've already heard that I was absolutely touched and delighted to help with the production of Nye, which tells the story of the NHS through the life and the death of Anira and Bevan, starring Michael Sheen. And this year I'm hoping, I've been involved in some advisory roles for some Channel 4 programmes, including the forthcoming Stepping Out, as well as some of the plots coming up over the next few years, which I can't tell you about, in the BBC health drama Casualty. Now, I thought, as well as telling you about what I've done, you need to hear from the patients that I've looked after. That's what the art of the evidence is about, is feedback. And I looked just before coming on some of the hospitals I've worked in, and there's some great feedback from people that came in unconscious, left alive, would recommend 5 stars. Lovely to hear. Not everybody is glass half full. Some people have said, amazing, they saved my life after my heart stopped multiple times. 4 stars? How can you get 5 stars nowadays? 4 stars for that. And on the other hand, some people are glass half full. Rude staff, filthy toilets, dangerous wards, people smoking everywhere, missed my broken leg. But glass half full, nice Costa, free parking. Fabulous, thank you for that. And there's just one thing I want to leave you with, really. So it's all very well talking about how we communicate science, how we communicate medicine, but so what? So is this just to fill a bookshelf, to fill another series on Netflix? And the truth is, no, it's not. This public engagement through art and through public engagement in medicine is incredibly important. In the COVID pandemic, for example, I found a lot of my time was spent actually trying to get rid of some of the mis and disinformation from people around vaccination, for example. I would often share some things which had been illustrated and explain why that was wrong. But unknown to me, I was falling victim of what we now know as the illusory truth effect. In other words, no matter how unlikely or untrue something is, the more you see it, the more you perceive it as true. So even me just sharing that debunking information, I was probably doing the job of misinformation for it. I was propagating those lies. And what we now know is the right way to combat the illusory truth effect is doing what we're doing today, to pre-bunk things, to tell people the beauty, the majesty of science through art, through words, through literature, through plays, through images, as you're going to hear. Sorry, that's my mum. And so we now know the importance of what we call pre-bunking. In other words, telling people about this before we give time for the mis and disinformation to occur. So what better way to pre-bunk and to finish this story? I mentioned about my work with Nye, the story of Nye Bevan. In the last night of that run, here in Cardiff, somebody very special came to see the play, along with Lee Mengo, who was playing Aneurin Bevan that night, he alongside Michael Sheen. This was actually the world's first baby born in the NHS, who was actually there in the audience. So in terms of telling a story, helping to make sense of a story, I think I can think of no better way to finish. So remember, your words have power, but it's not just words. And I'm absolutely delighted that Julie's going to now be able to talk to us about how your images as well as your words have power. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. That was fabulous and fascinating, and interesting in that your first piece that grabs us is, of course, an image of that wall. Images. I'm an image person, so for me that was the impact piece of at the start there, which was superb. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all. And I thought I'd go through my research, being a visual research, and I'll just share my screen here. Now, the image you may have seen of mine is Coco's drop, that was very fortunate to win the award with Humanimal Trust. And that basically is my research, is drops of water, and what they look like under the microscope, and what are they, what's happening, where do they come from. And if we look at this video here, this is what it's all about. This is that very drop drying. So this is Coco's saliva. He was a waddy dog, and that's sped up. It's ×8, so it's a fast rendition of it drying. Can take anything from 5 hours to 24 hours for a drop of water to dry, depending on where it comes from, on its source, and heating. What you're seeing there is the evaporation of the liquid, and what's left are the contaminants held within the water, or in this case the saliva. And those contaminants are unique to source. And when the drop dries, they form a pattern. And that pattern is like a fingerprint to the source of where the water's come from. It could be a raindrop. It could be your shower water. It could be your cup of coffee. If you think of a coffee ring on your granny's favorite table that you've wrecked, that coffee ring is actually evaporated water, and the contaminant that's left is the coffee grains. So what you're seeing there is the patterning. And if you looked at that under the microscope, you would actually have a pattern in there. So what we have here is these really spiky contaminants coming off. They're unique at the moment to Coco. I haven't seen that anywhere else. What is not unique is the central pattern there, what we call the eye of the drop. So that's what I'm looking at. Here we have something that anybody who works in the lab will be very familiar with. On the right is deionized water. Now it's claimed to be clean water, but of course it only has the metals taken out of it. So what we're seeing here is the biological matter that's left in the water. It's not clean water. It has residue in there. The only clean water I found is distilled water, and that's the drop on the left. That's A. And it's not quite pure. We've still got an edge to it and some contaminants visible in the middle, but compared to B, it's extremely clean. So any of you working in a lab, be aware, distilled is your clean water, and deionized still has biological contaminants and produces beautiful patterns. Again, the different machine will produce different patterns because it is a very sensitive science. And you never know exactly what you're going to get unless you're repeating from the same source. Now, my proof of concept for this was between phosphate and nitrate, means that I'm looking mainly at water quality. And as you can see, the central eye, what we call the eye of the drop. So within the drop, you have a gathering of contaminants, and that's called the eye. And they vary depending on the contaminant. And here we prove that phosphate and nitrate have very different patterns coming through. So they're identifiable. So this was a controlled environment, of course, controlled amounts of phosphate and nitrate within distilled water. And these are the two patterns that we got. The colouring is an interesting thing. It's not known what's causing the colouring as yet, and that's true of all these drops. I'm not the only one doing research on patterning. It's called DEM, which is the drop evaporation method. It is quite active within the medical field. A little bit within veterinary has happened. It's also within the commercial areas of printing, because they're interested in how the drops evaporate, and that what residue is left can affect printing quality and that kind of thing. It also happens in the drinks industry. So they've done some tests on whiskey, of all things, and Scottish whiskey comes out clean, and American is full of stuff. So much so, and so repeatable is it, that they're now developing a system so that they can identify fake whiskies, so that they know what they're dealing with. So it's kind of a funny use of the science, but there it is. Okay, and what's happening when a drop evaporates? You have two internal flows. You have the marangoni and you have the capillary. And the way that the internal dynamics work within the drop as it dries depend on the contaminant and on temperature, external temperature, and temperature of the substrate, what it's sitting on. And how it dries affects the pattern as well as the contaminants themselves, although the contaminants themselves impact on the way it dries. So it can get a bit confusing, but these two are the main two ways of a drop drying. And what we have at the edge is the pinning. You have the top of the drop there, and that has all the forces within it. And then you have this circulatory motion within the drop. And a drop always dries from the outside in. So if you think back to the video you just saw, it dried from the outside and gradually came inwards, and the pattern formed as you went. That always happens. And it's quite exciting because you never quite know what you're going to get. So this one here, this shows some of the pinning that we have. This is just a very small selection, and you can see quite beautiful. This is a very, very visual science, although I think to myself, what science isn't visual, really? Everything is pretty much visual. It's just these are beautiful patterns that come through with this. Of course, I can't just rely on the visual patterning when I'm looking and analysing. I have to do all the proper analysis with ZenBlue and all the mathematical side of things, the complicated bit. But in many respects, I can almost predict what results I'm going to get by looking at the patterns I have. And that makes it really interesting as well. So British Antarctic Survey is where my ice cores are coming from. Why did I choose ice cores to do? This was because I wanted what was fairly clean water. And I wanted water that could be of interest. In this case, historical interest. and I wanted something where analysis was already done. So I had some backup and I could check my research against analysis already done. And ice cores seemed an ideal opportunity for that. So this is sampling and collecting of ice cores with Dr. Robert Mulvaney at British Antarctic Survey. He's anything you need to know about Antarctic ice, this is the guy. He's a walking dictionary, fantastic fellow. And we sorted out these ice cores, and he didn't think I was going to get anything. He thought, oh, it's so pure because the contaminants are parts per billion, and I'd been dealing with parts per million for phosphate and nitrate. So a very different thing. So he thought there would be no patterning whatsoever. So, okay, slightly worrying, because if there were no patterns whatsoever, then my whole hypothesis was up in the air. And my hypothesis was that potentially the visuals from the drops could give a visual account of the history of environmental factors in Antarctica through the ice cores. So ice cores exist as annual layers of compacted ice, a bit like tree rings. And each one gives they're annual, so each one gives an annual indication of the environmental factors for that year. Now, if I could get some visuals on that, potentially a whole ice core, I could get a visual all the way along of our historical environment, and that was my aim. That's what I wanted. That was a big want for this period of research. So what I had was 10 samples as a starting point. So in a way, this is like prototype work. And luckily for me, I did have patterns. In fact, I had very stunning patterns through the samples. This is just some of them. So the top left is a 2-year-old sample. 2 years old means from the 1950s, 1952. And they class that as year 0. So this is from the 1950s, in fact, but they call it 2 years old. Some glaciology system. It's from the 50s. The second one at the top is from 13,000 years old. The next one along on the right is 32,000 years old. Then at the bottom on the left, we have 52,000 years old, and on the right, 120,000 years old. Ice cores until very recently have only gone down to 800,000 years old, for which I haven't tested yet. But they've actually just drilled the first million-year-old ice. It's actually 1,500,000-year-old ice they've just managed to get in Antarctica. So I'm hoping to get my paws on some of that at some point, because I imagine that would be really nice to see. But these are not random patterns. So here we have from 13,000 and 120,000, extremely similar. Now, Robert thought that potentially it was contamination from oil, from the drilling oil that was seeping into the ice cores, and that's what I was seeing, because he was determined that I wouldn't see any contaminants. So I did some tests on the drilling oil in distilled water, and of course, it was nothing like this. The oil separated out completely from the water in the center, so that's not what was causing this. So through my analysis, I found out that it's not actually the chemistry, which it was expected to be. It's not chemistry at all. So now I need to do further analysis and find out what's in there. It's obviously biological. So that'll be some electron microscopy happening. That's the next stage. Magnification, these are just 20 times magnified. So very, very low magnification. You can almost see these patterns with the naked eye. So when you see your stains on a window when it's been raining, what you're looking at are loads of little patterns. When on your shower door, all that staining, it's all contaminants from the water, and it's all patterns. If you looked at it under a microscope, or maybe a microscope on your phone, you'd be able to see it. So it's quite fascinating, and I hope it'll get you looking at water in a slightly different way. So the second part is the communication of things. And And what you've been looking at are, they're called photomicrographs, and basically it's photographs through the microscope. And I have a side interest going, which is animal saliva. It's not something I've been able to really dig into too much yet. In human terms, it is studied, but not, as far as I'm aware, too much in veterinary. These are two dogs, Coco on the right, Chippy on the left. No longer with us now, unfortunately, but I've got their drops. And they look very different, don't they? But if you look at the eye, or the main area of contaminants in the center, that patterning is actually very similar. And I've done a greyhound who had exactly the same, so around the edge quite different, but in the middle exactly the same. They also have this on the Chippies on the left, you can see this bright blue band around. Coco's has a little bit of that colouring, so that's obviously a particular contaminant. I don't know what yet. And the greyhound had quite a bit of that as well. And I hope to do more testing to find out what's going on. The drop evaluation method has been used in some animals to see their peak fertility time. It hasn't really worked. It doesn't really work in dogs. They tried orangutans, they tried cattle. It doesn't really work. They have also done it for humans. And they say it works. So in America, they're selling packs for it. So you can find out when you're the most fertile and through a drop of saliva. But they don't take into account in any of this what the person or the animal has just eaten. And that to me seems like a basic thing to look at. What have they drunk and eaten? That might just affect what you're looking at here. So I know that Chippy had a sausage and Coco hadn't. So there's potential that that's what was causing the different external patterning. Although the greyhound also had clean palate and he didn't have anything. But there is something there, something going on that I want to dig deeper into. So by comparison, this is human saliva, 2 individuals. These two were quite unexpected because the saliva I tried before had a lot of dendrite formations in there. These had very, very little. This is being researched to a certain extent. Saliva is being looked at in humans for diagnostics, along with blood and teardrops. And there's some urine work going on as well. But it's not really happening in the animal side. And when I look and compare them, so we have dogs, humans, sheep, and pigs, we have very, very different patternations going on. Now, I haven't done any of the proper analysis on this. It's purely visual at the moment. And it's quite intriguing what I'm seeing visually, and is leading me to believe maybe there's something going on here that I'd like to dig into a bit more. So that's something I'd like to continue alongside the ice core work. And when it comes to tears, this is a human tear. These are called dendrites, these beautiful feathered patterns that you have here. Yeah, absolutely stunning visuals, and people seem to react to them really well. And here's blood. This is a drop of blood, detail, of course, but quite stunning visuals. And you don't need high quality or high resolution equipment to be able to get nice images. Now, talking of visuals, where do I come from? Well, my background is scientific illustration. I was scientific illustrator. I studied at Middlesex University. And in those days, it was all hand-rendered things, all scale drawings, medical, zoological, botanical, and wonderful thing to do. But of course, these days, it's moved into the digital world. So whilst some hand rendering is done, it's mainly digital now, which has kind of changed the feel of the field for me anyway, although stunning visuals can be still produced. I also do this kind of thing. This is a life-size elephant skull. It's called The Last Elephant. If you look on the side of the cranium there, you can see the outline of an elephant. And it's their closest living relative genetically is the rock hyrax. So that's the story with that. It was at the peak of poaching, and I felt I needed to do something to highlight. So this was a piece that I created a big piece to highlight that. The skull was one that I came across in Tanzania that had been poached. So it was quite evocative. And then how to use that with my water drops. Do I just keep the science as it is, or do I expand from doing the science into communicating it? Well, I've been communicating it as well, not just through the photomicrographs, but through scientific illustration. So on the left here, we have all the ice core drops scientifically illustrated, which means I can remove any anomalies of light that the microscope casts and that a camera picks up. So a camera will very often turn areas magenta, and it's something to do with the light of the microscope. Now, I know that can happen, and I know when I look through, I'm not seeing it, it's only through the camera. So by scientifically illustrating it, I can remove any of that kind of anomaly and just focus on the basic patterns that I'm seeing and the basic colors that I know are true to those drops. So green is an interesting color that comes through occasionally. To start with, I thought that was caused by the glass that the glass slide that the drops are on. Because that has a green tint, obviously being glass, but it has turned up in some drops and not others, and yet the lighting is always consistent. So the green is something else. It means something, again, that's not been researched. The colors that I'm seeing have not been researched yet. So that's something else I want to do with the electron microscopy, is go into the individual particles and find out, what are the blue ones, and do some identification and find out what's happening there. But I decided to take it a stage further, and I did an exhibition at the Nature and Art Museum in Gloucestershire, and I created what I call 3D illuminated cubes, and they're made of recycled CD cases, and they're layered, so they become 3D pieces, and as you move around them they change. But if you look at them directly front on, that is what you see through the microscope. So that's taking a water drop into a 3D level. Now, the reason I thought of doing 3D is that when you look through the microscope, the particles themselves actually do not land all flat on the substrates. They are slightly on top of each other. There is an element of 3D in there. So I wanted to emphasize that somewhat and portray that. And I also thought it would be more engaging to the public if it was something that they could walk around and it changed and that kind of thing. So that's the communication side that I've used. And so I find myself, having started off as a scientific illustrator, communicating science, actually doing science, and then communicating that as well. So it's kind of, in its way, it's come full circle. So yeah, that's me.
It's absolutely fascinating and beautiful. Thank you very much, Julian. Thank you very much, Matt, as well. We're absolutely fantastic. Thank you. We're going to open it up to questions. So if you have any questions, you can either put your hand up or you can put it into the chat. If you put it into the chat, that would be great. Or any way that you wanted to get some questions across. Again, thank you so much for that. That's just brilliant. And it's good to see that, as usual, Guinness holds the answer for most things. Is usually an instigating point for solving all of the world's problems. I will ask quickly until we have any other questions. Do you have, Matt, a favorite fact about comparative physiology between humans and animals? Is there a particular one?
Yeah, I guess overall, I'd probably have to choose the giraffe just because it does so many things, especially in my specialty of critical care. So the giraffe has an amazing ability to manage dead space because of such a 2.5 meter long neck. And in intensive care, we have lots of ways to connect people to breathing machines. So we have to manage dead space. And in fact, a giraffe breathes the same way as we now ventilate patients with asthma to minimize dead space. It has fascinating cerebral perfusion issues. So, 300 millimeters of mercury as a blood pressure, same way as we manage people with brain injuries. It has anti-gravity skin in its legs, like you have in a fighter jet, to prevent venous pooling. So it's just got so many crazy bits to it. And a giraffe can also probably prove that intelligent design isn't the way that we evolved, because its recurrent laryngeal nerve winds down 2 meters around one of its vascular arches and back up to its vocal cord, which doesn't seem particularly intelligent. So for me, it has to be the giraffe.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'd love to ask as well. I mean, we talked about the Guinness, but how is Irish whiskey, Julie? You mentioned Scotch whiskey and American.
I don't think they've tested Irish.
That's a shame.
That is a shame, but I'm sure it's full of good stuff.
I bet it is. Jameson's the way to go. And on a serious note, do you have a favorite pattern? Is there something that particularly speaks to you that is your favorite out of all of the impurities?
I have a couple really. I love the 120,000-year-old ice core drop. I think that's beautiful, but possibly cocos and chippies. I'd have to include both of them. Those two, because it's personal to me, and they're so different and intriguing. They're similar and yet so different, and there's a story in there that I've got to unravel. I've got to find out what's happening in there. So yeah, I think those ones.
Yeah. Do you think at some point you'll be able to identify species or even breeds of dog through there?
That's what I want to do. I'll probably have to go to a rescue so I can get as many different types of dogs as possible, and offer them all sausages and get as much saliva as possible. And then I can start comparing and contrasting lots of different breeds. I also want to try other canines, so wolves, foxes, and take it out into the wild life as well, and see what we're dealing with. And then there's the comparison with cats and apes, and it's endless, isn't it?
Yeah.
So yeah, the problem is restricting myself really, because you've got to focus you've got to get proof of concept and everything right in place first. So you have to restrict yourself. So I will start off with dogs, and then other canines, and then see where we go with it.
Amazing. Well, thank you both very, very much. We've no questions that I can see in the chat. If anybody wants to ask any questions in the future, or if they want to find anything out about our speakers or Humanimal Trust, I'll put my email address in the chat now. Please reach out. Feel free to reach out to me, and I'll pass on any questions. And if you want to know more about Humanimal Trust, you can look on our website and look on our socials. But again, amazing talks today. Thank you so much.